Risks in the financial sector
move massive sums of money in and out of the country beyond the official annual quota of $50,000. The shady practice has become a thorn big enough to affect China's economy. That's according to Professor Chen Jingying.
It has been used to launder money by corrupt officials and businessmen.
Here's an example of how an underground bank works. You set up a series of accounts in both Chinese and foreign banks. When a customer from the Chinese mainland wants to convert, say, 1 million RMB to US dollars, you simply ask him to deposit the money in your domestic account and withdraw US dollars from your overseas account. When the transaction is completed, no money has actually crossed any borders. So to operate an underground bank, you need huge amounts of cash in both of your accounts.
In a campaign in 2017, authorities exposed underground banks that collectively held some 300 billion yuan. The criminals were charged with 200 million yuan just in fines alone.
The bigger problem right now is that many underground banks have evolved. They used to be family-owned, but now they set up shell trading companies and move money through corporate wire transfers.
It is very, very difficult for banks to examine the huge amounts of electronic transfers and determine which ones are illegal.
Individuals aren't the only ones using underground banks. Professor Chen says some state-owned and foreign firms are involved too. One might ask, why would companies use illegal ways to move their legitimate money?
It is because the legal ways require too much paperwork and time. Therefore, the situation should serve as a warning bell for Chinese banks who need to improve their efficiency.
Professor Chen is among those calling for reforms in the banking sector. She is also proposing to the NPC for an upgrade in China's criminal laws and pass stricter anti-money laundering legislation to thwart the underground banks. Harsher punishment and fewer loopholes are expected to help China deal with the brewing banking menace. Yang Chengxi, CGTN, Shanghai.
The country's economic boom has transformed several Chinese companies into some of the biggest in the world. But their debt levels are causing concern about the country's overall economic health. So how much does it matter? CGTN's Owen Fairclough explains.
The Four Seasons Hotel here in Washington, D.C. is a five-star piece of luxury. It's owned by one of China's biggest companies, and it's a symbol of China's growing appetite for buying some of the West's most expensive assets. But this global shopping spree has also contributed to a huge debt pile in China. Too much for insurance conglomerate Anbang. Fearing it was on the verge of collapse, China's government took over, and for some, that's a sign of trouble.
Debt levels in China have made many people argue that it's facing an imminent financial crisis.
China's total debt is now around 260% of economic output. That's way beyond the numbers for Eurozone countries that were bankrupted by the global financial crisis. But look beyond that headline figure, and the situation is much more nuanced and particular to China.
Borrowings of households is not particularly a big issue. Local governments have been borrowing a lot, but they had very low debt levels in the past. So even though it's risen, that's not the issue. It's the debt of the firms which really distinguishes China.
China insists it can manage that corporate debt load because it's the ultimate guarantor of the biggest state-owned banks. It's also reining in overstretched companies by supporting a program that exchanges debt for equity. And China isn't alone. Debt is surging across the world. The US government has periodically been forced to shut down. It's happened twice already this year because it hit a debt ceiling that had to be raised before the actual business of running the country could resume. So, with the world's two biggest economies now so heavily in the red, how concerned should we be?
Eventually, at some point in time, if this debt continues to mount, countries start to lose that flexibility. And that's what you saw in Europe with countries like Greece or in Spain or during the Asian financial crisis. So it's an issue that we're monitoring, but it's not reached the stage at which we can see what I would call financial crisis emerging.
10 years after too much debt nearly brought down the entire global financial system, the hope is that this time the numbers aren't too big to fail. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Joining us to discuss the issue of China's debt levels is Jack Pakowski. He spent many years doing business in China and is managing partner of JFP Holdings. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Nice to talk to you.
So looking at China's current debt issue, including local, government, corporate and household debt, how serious is this and what's the economic impact?
Well, I think that when you look at China's debt and compare it to other countries, what you need to understand is the composition of China's debt is substantially different. In most other countries, the government debt is very high, and also household debt is very high. In China, actually, the central government debt is very low. Local government debt is higher, obviously, but household debt is low. The real issue is the corporate debt. The corporate debt in China is about 18 trillion, the equivalent of $18 trillion, and about 70% of that is is held by state-owned enterprises. So basically, at the root of the problem is the fact that the state-owned enterprises, which are fundamentally less profitable than the private companies, get the lion's share of the debt. And that's really the issue.
Now, in terms of other risks, there also remain challenges in overcapacity, zombie companies, shadow banking, and keeping property markets stable. What's the strategy for addressing these risks?
Well, it has to be kind of a multi-pronged strategy. Number one, I think some of the companies and some of the debts just have to be written off, or the companies have to go bankrupt, which obviously is a difficult thing. In other cases, China owns, for the most part, the large state-owned banks, so therefore they, they can be encouraged to, restructure those loans or to forgive those loans in some, fashion, or to accept equity. I think that reforms in the stock market are needed so that equity plays a much bigger role in financing companies than debt. So there are a lot of different measures, that need to be taken. There's not really one thing that China can do to solve the problem. It's really going to have to be a multifaceted approach.
And what sort of efforts have we seen so far on the part of the government to really try and stave off these systemic risks?
Well, China is starting to close down overcapacity, and that's a real issue. I mean, China today has over 50% of the world's capacity in steel, and the same in aluminum, and that's now causing, problems on the trade front, as we've seen in recent days. So, China has started to force companies to reduce overcapacity and so forth, but there's a long way to go. What I always say, in China, there's no such thing as a small problem or a small opportunity. There are only big problems and big opportunities, and that's because of the sheer size of the country and its population.
Now, in terms of any new or additional measures that you expect to be taken on this year to really try and rein in some of these financial risks we're seeing in China, what do you think they might be?
Well, I think that, China will continue to monitor very closely the outflow of capital. And basically in 2017, China really made it very, very difficult for Chinese companies to expand overseas and to exchange RMB to hard currencies. And I suspect that that's part of the reason why you've seen these underground banks come up and, finding innovative ways